Welcome back to Face the Nation. We want to speak now to FEMA Administrator Brock Long. He left the Trump administration in March, and now he is back in his home state of North Carolina. He joins us from Charlotte this morning. Brock, good to have you on the program.
Good to be with you.
Now, we are learning that this is not just a Category 5 hurricane, but it's one of the largest hurricanes ever, and particularly for that northwest part of the Bahamas, the strongest hurricane that place has ever seen. How should FEMA be focused right now?
Well, unfortunately, there are a few things that scare me, not only the wind intensity of this storm, but what I really like to pay attention to is the forward speed of the storm. And if you notice in this forecast, it's actually forecast to stall and slow down even further. And when that happens, I know that the model guidance really doesn't handle storms that well, and the track could change tremendously over the next 24 to 48 hours. So FEMA's trying to get the word out to anybody from Florida to North Carolina. One, please don't let your guard down, because even if the center of circulation travels that left-hand side of the air cone, it could bring tremendous hit to Florida and other states as it passes up through the southeast. But what FEMA focuses on is trying to properly stage incident management teams, logistical support, when it comes to supplies, food, commodities to back up state efforts. And they always want to push as close to the storm as they can without putting people in harm's way.
Mm-hmm. You heard from the Homeland Security Secretary that they do not project this storm to be making landfall in the U.S. right now, but what you're saying is you don't think it is that certain.
I know that here again, when you go back to the forward speed, there's a lot of uncertainty in this in the track forecast. And when a storm basically comes to a halt until it starts to move again, the model guidance doesn't typically pick it up. But looking at the model guidance, it is in good agreement that the storm is going to turn back to the southeast. But we got to continue to watch it over the next 24 to 48 hours, no doubt about it.
Now, in terms of disaster preparedness and response, FEMA doesn't have a permanent leader, hasn't since you left the job. The Homeland Security Secretary is also in an acting position. Does this lack of permanence affect the ability of the agencies to act?
It's never ideal to not have a confirmed administrator in the position at FEMA, but I brought Jeff Byard as well as Pete Gaynor in, and knowing that those two guys are back there working with, in control of FEMA, I have great confidence. They're two of the best emergency managers I've ever met, and they're actually backed up by 20,000 of the most battle-hardened FEMA staff that's ever existed. I mean, these guys have been through it over the last 2 years. They've been responding to storms and events from across half the globe. A lot of Americans don't realize that they responded to the Northern Marianas when they were hit with the strongest storm in history in Hurricane U2. And they've responded all the way to the Virgin Islands and the East Coast. When we were in office, or when I was in office, I had over 220 different events, basically a new event every 3 or 4 days. And these guys have been truly dedicated. They bust their rear ends to serve other people. And I sleep peacefully knowing that Pete's there, Jeff's there, and the experienced FEMA staff is in place.
You're praising the leadership, but you have been critical of the agency's functions recently. You said that it's dying a death of 1,000 cuts. It's understaffed. You think it could be more efficient. Are you concerned the agency isn't adequate to the challenges?
Well, I think FEMA faces unrealistic expectations by Congress and the American public, and the standards in which we declare major disaster declarations need to be increased. If you look at 50% of the disasters that FEMA has historically declared, they're less than $7.5 million. And in some cases, we've got to stop looking at FEMA as 911. This is a partnership. If we want to get better and become more resilient and respond better, then we have to refocus the training upon how we ask citizens to be prepared, not just going out and having supplies for 5 to 7 days, but teaching them how to become more financially resilient, teaching them that insurance is the first line of defense, not FEMA, teaching them tangible skills like CPR when they face active shooter events. But we also have to bolster state and local capabilities. But more importantly, until Congress starts to incentivize putting building codes in place, land use planning in place, incentivizing states and locals for ensuring their public infrastructure, FEMA's job is impossible. So it wasn't a knock on FEMA. It's just we have to set realistic expectations for the agency and really bolster the capability from neighbor helping neighbor all the way to the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
You were administrator when Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, which you know the Trump administration was harshly criticized for. Are the solutions you just laid out, is that what you learned?
Well, the problem, what made Puerto Rico really difficult is because a lot of the infrastructure rotted and decayed over a long period of time, no doubt about it. And if Americans may not remember, but I had to ask for special authority to actually put funding forward on behalf of FEMA to fix Puerto Rico because of that. FEMA doesn't have the authority to fix infrastructure that's not well maintained. And so when infrastructure is not maintained, the impacts of a hurricane are going to be exponentially worse than what they should be. So, putting Puerto Rico and that issue aside, going forward here again, we've got to start electing officials based on building codes and land use planning and those who advocate that, and building incentives. Start providing more funding to the communities that implement and uphold stronger building codes, because they work.
I know that you fought for funding for Puerto Rico. I think it's now $42 billion that Congress has approved to help Puerto Rico rebuild, and not all of it's been dispersed. But the president tweeted this week that Puerto Rico is one of the most corrupt places on earth, and said it's really a matter of broken politicians, corruption, and that the money's being sent to crooked politicians. What do you make of the president's comments, given that you fought so hard for this funding?
Well, I think where the president, I'm not going to speak for the president of the United States, but, having worked with Puerto Rico, and we've seen recently that the leadership of the Commonwealth has collapsed. If American taxpayers are going to put, billions and billions of dollars into rebuilding not only Puerto Rico, but other jurisdictions, then, Congress really needs to focus on making sure that once that infrastructure is rebuilt, that it's maintained for years to come. And I think that's the greatest concern that Congress needs to be focused on. And here again, Hurricane Maria was far greater of an issue than just FEMA's response. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, a lot of people inside FEMA, including myself, believe that we kept Puerto Rico from complete and total collapse.
All right. Brock Long, thank you for sharing your insights with us, and we will continue to be covering the storm. We will be right back. It's time now for some analysis from our political panel. Shane Harris covers intelligence and national security for The Washington Post. Salena Zito is a columnist for The Washington Examiner. David Nakamura covers the White House, also for The Washington Post. And Sahil Kapur is a political reporter for Bloomberg News. Shane, Sahil, welcome to the broadcast. Good to have both of you back at the table as well. David, I want to start off with this storm. The Trump administration obviously faced a lot of criticism for how it handled Hurricane Maria. Is this all hands on deck focus a response to that?
It seems to be all hands on deck. You had a good interview with Kevin McAleenan at DHS, right there at headquarters. We don't know, though, if the President of the United States is as focused as he claims that he is. He canceled a trip to Poland to stay home and monitor this storm. He sent Mike Pence instead. Pence just gave a speech today, but the President yesterday left Camp David, where he was apparently monitoring the storm, to play a round of golf at his local club. And he's been tweeting this morning about various topics. Yes, about the hurricanes. We don't know about other things. The President has politicized hurricane recovery very pointedly about Puerto Rico, we know. And so the question of how much he is focused on this remains an open question.
So Puerto Rico seems to not be in the direct line of this particular storm, but 2 years after Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico continues to be brought up as a political issue, particularly by the 2020 candidates. Why is that? What is the motivation behind it?
It seems like the president's tone has changed on the hurricane as the path of the hurricane has changed. It was first irritation. It was kind of like, we're going to have to do another rescue package for Puerto Rico, and he's obviously had a back and forth there. Now the path of the hurricane has changed toward Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and he has taken on a much more somber tone. He's tweeting out alerts by FEMA. He's asking everyone to be careful and to be prepared. Some of this goes back to the fact that the president gets irritated by parts of the country that don't like him, and he praises frequently parts of the country that do like him.
But the candidates themselves, so many of these Democratic candidates have made Puerto Rico even a campaign stop for themselves.
Right, and I think that you'll see that continue. There's a constituency there that they're trying to speak to. Aid for Puerto Rico after that hurricane has been an issue that some candidates, particularly Julian Castro, who's trying to become the first Latino president, has talked about a lot. And I think we'll see more of that going forward.
Salena, I know you are always, you have your ear to the ground. This road trip you just did, 6,000 miles across the country. Yeah. When you see these sort of action-oriented moments for the president, does this end up being a political asset for him? I mean, are people as focused on this storm as all of us in the news business are?
Well, I think the people are focused on the well-being of their fellow countrymen. I mean, I think that's the thing that people think about the most. There's a level of expectation, in particular with people who did vote for Trump, that didn't always particularly care for his comportment. And sometimes the way he handles things, they're like, please. But they are obviously concerned about people, where they live, what's going to happen, how it's going to impact them, not just on the coast, but there's going to be major flooding that hits the interior of the country because of this, meaning places like Tennessee or Alabama or all the way up into Pennsylvania and West Virginia. So there's going to be a broader impact, I think, and so people are paying attention to that. I think there's a level of expectation that Trump is always going to behave the way he does on Twitter. Sometimes it makes them feel comfortable and happy and like, go get it. Sometimes they're like, come on.
Shane, we did just see from the president that he acknowledged the shooting in Texas that happened yesterday. We don't still know much about the motive or what happened, why this shooting happened. But are we going to relaunch this conversation on a national security basis, on a homeland security basis about gun legislation in a few weeks?
Certainly, if we find there's any kind of motive that's connected to domestic terrorism, as there was in the El Paso case, yes, I think you'd see that debate kind of get reignited again. I mean, here we are sort of bookending the month of August with an attack at the beginning and another at the end. And it's another reminder at a time when it seemed like the wind had kind of gone out of the sails of that debate a bit when the president was deferring to Congress. But within the national security community and the homeland security world, there is kind of, I won't say a renewed focus on gun violence as a possible outgrowth of domestic terrorism, but people are starting to make those linkages that I think a lot of people on the operational level have been aware of for quite some time. So if you find that kind of linkage again with this shooting in Texas, then I would suspect, yes, it'll be yet another palpable example.
Salena, Beto O'Rourke on the program argued that even in the state of Texas, there is a shift in sentiment, an openness, he argues, to gun control reform. Is that something you heard on your road trip?
There definitely is. There is a sentiment about needing to do something. And I think people really struggle with understanding what that something is. I think that they believe in conversations that I've had, it does have to do with a different measure, a different sort of barrier to gun purchases by or a background check. But it also, people also, they're really frustrated with how Washington handles it. They don't believe, everyone sort of is yelling at each other. And in the middle is this problem, whether it's guns or whether it's mental illness, or maybe it's a combination of all of a bunch of different things. But people are really frustrated by just being unable to have this conversation.
But the polls show that, in fact, the majorities of both parties support stronger legislation, including background checks. The president, though, even though he's hinted at different times, including earlier this month and last year during the Parkland shootings in Florida, that he was maybe open to some sort of stronger, much stronger background checks. But he's been lobbied heavily by the NRA, as they do each time, to pose any kind of new gun laws or restrictions. And the president has seemed to backtrack once again, because he seems to really be appealing to his strongest supporters. And he's been warned specifically by the NRA that there would be a backlash to anything like this. So as much as there could be talk about stronger gun laws again in Congress, it's very unlikely that anything is going to change.
That's true.
There'll be growing pressure on Congress to act, and one of the reasons that 90-10 issues like background checks can't seem to get through is that there's a fear among Republican leaders that those kinds of attempts will be portrayed in parts of the country and by activist groups like the NRA as an existential threat to the Second Amendment. It's not about the specific issue, it's this mentality that vast swaths of the country have, that any attempt at gun control, no matter how popular, no matter how modest, is a step to ultimately taking away their guns. And we've seen seen a massive shift in the politics of guns, something like 30 points in the direction of stricter gun control since the Obama era, as mass shootings become more and more routine. Even banning semi-automatic assault weapons military style is now a 2-to-1 popular issue in the United States, which we hadn't seen before. Still, prospects for action are dubious right now.
Shane, speaking of existential threats, we heard from James Mattis for the very first time since he resigned from the Trump administration. He wrote in a Wall Street Journal essay this week that what concerns him right now about the country are not our external adversaries, it's our internal divisiveness. We all know we're better than our current politics, he wrote. Tribalism must not be allowed to destroy our experiment. I read that not as an indictment of the administration, but as an indictment of the American people right now, where we are as a country.
Yeah, and the political system, and sort of a wake-up call to them and trying to summon them to some kind of place where we can, as you said, we're not shouting at each other and really pointing out that there is a real risk to this sort of the secure fabric of the country and to the fragile democracy that we have from this kind of tribalism. You had to read between the lines a lot on his comments about Trump. You did not on this one. And he also talked about fraying international alliances. The reason that he resigned, of course, he's talked about that was because he felt that we were backing away from those alliances, and also the pullout of Syria. This was remarkable to hear somebody who has spent his career focused on foreign threats and on protecting the country from external adversaries, now turning inward and saying this is actually the thing that could take us down.
And in his first television interview with our CBS's David Martin, he laid out criticisms of the Bush administration and the Iraq War, though he was careful in how he worded it. Criticism of the Obama administration not perceiving the threat in the same way from Iran, he told David. And in the Trump administration, the only criticism we heard so far is what Shane highlighted, not valuing alliances the way he thought was proper. There seemed this expectation or disappointment among some, particularly Democrats, that he didn't come out swinging at the commander-in-chief.
I think you see Democrats holding their hopes first, Robert Mueller and James Mattis of sort of coming out and very forcefully advocating for a position against the president and his policies. By resigning, he made clear that he doesn't support what the president was trying to do in places of the world, including Afghanistan. But more broadly, I think he made it clear that as a military man, he's not interested in impugning sort of a sitting president in that way. And as Shane said, you had to read between the lines in what he was saying. I think, though, this is a time where opponents of the president think you got to take a much clearer stand, and that someone like Mattis has that gravitas to sort of break through beyond the partisanship to deliver that message. But once he does so, he becomes part of the partisanship that he's decrying.
And Mattis I think he really nailed it in terms of understanding what's going on in the country. I've often said Trump he's not the cause of his presidency. He's a result of people not liking what happened under Bush or what happened under Obama. So they decided to go with sort of this difference, and I think that is a reflection of that.
Yeah, the question is whether, Mattis has something to say and whether he's potentially holding back. The values he fought for as a commander for all those years are for private citizens, which he is now to speak about, to speak their thoughts about their government and to be critical if he wants to. So I think that's where people are. If you have something to say about the president, say it. In 15 months, the country is going to decide whether to give him another 4 years.
Someone who did, James Comey. He did say what he thought of the president, and you had him on Twitter sort of saying he was vindicated by this Inspector General report, which did not recommend any kind of prosecution and said he didn't reveal classified info. What do we actually need to know about it?
Well, it seems like this issue is so entrenched, public opinion is so calcified on the question of James Comey, the Russia investigation, everything leading up to it. The president has galvanized his supporters to doubt this entire narrative and to believe that there was a conspiracy against him. Jim Comey tweeted out that there was no vindication of his own of his own sort, that he didn't quite do anything wrong in terms of releasing classified information to the press. So I think everyone's in their corners on this issue. I don't think public opinion changes.
It's also, Comey's holding himself out, though, as somebody who he's not denying that he actually broke internal FBI rules, which is what the IG report found, even if I found he didn't reveal classified information. But he's essentially holding him out as someone who said, I saw something wrong that was happening, and I decided to do something about it. Now, the IG report excoriated him for that, essentially really saying that he decided he was the one who could break the rules. It really sort of implicitly cast him as this kind of self-righteous figure, which a lot of Jim Comey's critics have said. He has very much the opposite of Jim Mattis, has been willingly casting himself as the voice of kind of sane government that's attacking the president, and it has pushed people farther into their camps.
Right.
Jim Comey's not convincing anyone that wasn't already with him.
Right.
You see,
Well,
Trump. Okay.
David, sorry, I have to leave it there because we have a very important report from Syria we have to get to in just a moment. On Saturday, U.S. forces conducted airstrikes on an al-Qaeda facility in Idlib province in northwest Syria. At least 40 militants were reportedly killed. In the last few months, fighting in the province has intensified as the Assad regime tries to regain control of the rebel-held territory. Our Holly Williams traveled there and filed this report for us.
The Syrian regime is trying to bomb Idlib and its 3 million people into submission. The airstrikes target hospitals, markets and bakeries. It's a ruthless strategy and makes visiting Idlib nerve-wracking. But it's helping the regime and its Russian backers claw back control of the country.
This is one of the main roads in Syria. It goes all the way from the capital Damascus to the north. And that's why regime forces are trying to recapture it.
The town of Han Shaihoun straddles the highway and was overrun by regime forces this month. Residents fled in their tens of thousands. The Derwish family lives north of Han Shaihoun, and we found them by the roadside, their most valuable possessions packed and ready to leave. They said the bombing raids had come within 200 yards of their home.
Where are you going to live? Are you going to have a roof over your head?
We don't know where we're going, Hayat told us. You may remember the name Han Shaihoun. As journalists, we'll never forget it. It was the scene of a deadly chemical attack in 2017 that killed nearly 100 and horrified the outside world. Abdelhamid Al-Yusuf lost his twin babies and cradled their lifeless bodies as he took them to be buried. He told us he joined the Syrian revolution in 2011, only to see his country spiral into civil war.
Could you ever have imagined that Syria would come to this?
We took to the streets to ask for freedom, he told us, and for a better life. President Trump called the chemical attack evil and ordered military strikes on the Syrian regime. But it didn't prevent this merciless air campaign. It didn't protect the people of Han Shaihoun.
That's our Holly Williams reporting from Idlib. We'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. We want to take a moment to say goodbye to Face the Nation's senior producer, Ed Ferguson, who spent every Sunday morning for the last 3 years in our control room. He's still going to be working on Sundays, but that's with our friends over at Sunday Morning. Thank you, Ed, for all of your hard work. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.